Section G, just so you know, this video is more or less all civil rights stuff in the 60s. So Section G, the struggle for civil rights. Okay, in the 1960 campaign, our Democratic President JFK had promised to support civil rights. However, he was very slow at getting around to actually supporting civil rights legislation, that sort of thing. During his campaign, he promised to end segregation with one stroke of his pen. So in protest to the slowness of JFK, there was actually a campaign where thousands of pens were sent to the White House to help JFK fulfill his promise of ending segregation with the stroke of the pen. But nonetheless, we mentioned this before, JFK had only a slight majority of Democrats in Congress, so he couldn't afford to upset the Southern Democrats. Especially he needed their support for some of his reforms, like supporting federal support of education, helping the elderly out with medicine, that sort of thing. And his justification was, these reforms, helping education, helping the elderly, are going to help the African American community just as much as civil rights legislation. But nonetheless, the civil rights movement did not put on brakes just because JFK did. We see a lot of things happening. We see a continual wave of sit-in movements, and also now we start to see the Freedom Riders. And these people were trying to end the segregation in interstate buses. This sometimes would lead to violence. For example, in May 1961, one of these buses was torched. And we see a lot of different riots protesting, the Southerners protesting this segregated bus thing, right? Protesting the Freedom Riders. And the Southern governments decided to do nothing about these riots, so D.C. actually sent down federal marshals to protect the Freedom Riders. Kind of a hot mess. Well, eventually, JFK, their administration started to actually back the civil rights movement, but they wanted to make sure that Martin Luther King wasn't communist at all, that he didn't have any skeletons in his closet. So they actually wiretapped his phone to make sure he wasn't conspiring with any communist. But other than the wiretapping incident, really JFK and Martin Luther King, they got along very well. They're very supportive of one another. Another issue, struggle for civil rights. A huge issue was trying to desegregate colleges. Especially Southern colleges. Ole Miss, right, the University of Mississippi, we had a black Air Force veteran, 29-year-old James Meredith, attempting to register in October of 1962. Guess what class he was registered for? Colonial American History. Nonetheless, this African-American James Meredith, trying to register for votes at Ole Miss, register for class at Ole Miss, causes this huge backlash, so much so that JFK sends down 400 federal marshals and 300 troops to enroll James Meredith in his first class. All right. Continuing on. Spring of '63, Martin Luther King Jr.'s campaign against discrimination is now going to be focused in Birmingham, Alabama. In Birmingham, about half of the population was African American, but only about 15% of those registered to vote were African Americans. And this was really an epicenter of segregation. Birmingham was definitely kind of one of those very combative areas. Previous attempts at desegregation, that sort of thing, had led to over 50 cross burnings and 18 bomb attacks. And and Martin Luther King, as he was preparing his volunteers to go into Birmingham, he said, "Some of the people sitting here will not come back alive." And we saw King and his peaceful protesters being attacked viciously by the police on TV, right? We saw attack dogs, electric cattle prodders, high-pressure water hoses, and the water doesn't sound very formidable, but it was so high pressure that it could take bark off of trees, it could knock bricks loose out of buildings, so a lot of very violent measures being taken against these peaceful protesters in Birmingham, and of course all of this is now televised. All right. JFK, in response to all of this chaos going down in Birmingham, gives a televised speech in June of '63, and he really made this into a moral issue, committing himself to resolving it, saying that the principle at stake is as old as the scriptures and as clear as the American Constitution, and he really called for new civil rights legislation. Okay, so African American community loving this speech, really wanting to support this proposed legislation, decided to march on Washington. And that's exactly what they did. So the speech was in June. So in August of '63, the March on Washington was held. 200,000 black and white demonstrators peacefully marched into D.C. in support of this proposed legislation. And this is, of course, where King gave his famous "I Had a Dream" speech. But even after, JFK has this televised speech, even after this huge peaceful protest, violence is still ensuing. Even the night of JFK's speech, we see Meager Evan, a black Mississippi civil rights worker, was shot by white gunmen. In September of 1963, 4 girls in the basement of a Baptist church were killed when the church was bombed in Birmingham. And then even by, we're not going to get there yet, we'll get there shortly, but even by the time of JFK's assassination, the civil rights bill that he had proposed still was really getting nowhere. So we see a lot of frustration. Things are not going well in Birmingham. Civil rights bill is just not coming to fruition. Bringing us to Section H, the killing of Kennedy. So just so you know, there's a lot of rumors about conspiracies and that sort of thing following this assassination, but we're a history class, right? We're not going to worry about that for now. Nonetheless, what happened on November 22nd of 1963 in Dallas, Texas, in an open limousine, JFK was shot in the head by a concealed gunman. The alleged assassin, the person who shot JFK, Lee Harvey Oswald, was actually shot himself by self-appointed avenger Jack Ruby. So this is kind of a crazy series of events which leads to all of these conspiracy theories. But right, JFK was in the limousine. He was shot, we think, by Lee Harvey Oswald. However, we won't know if there was a conspiracy or anything like that, because before Lee Harvey Oswald could take the stand, that sort of thing, he was shot by another guy, Jack Ruby, kind of the self-appointed avenger of Kennedy. So this whole series of events is just kind of crazy, sort of speak. Earl Warren, the head of course, the Supreme Court, puts forth this huge investigation to try to figure out what's going on. But even this official investigation still can't stop what is still around today, which is a lot of conspiracy theories regarding his assassination. Was there one shooter? Were there two? Was it a communist thing? Was it, gangsters trying to get back at JFK for, trying to thwart their gangster lifestyle? We don't know. Nonetheless. So what happens? The president is shot, and dies rather instantly, getting shot in the head. The vice president, LBJ Johnson, remember he's from Texas. He was trying to run against Kennedy, but ended up to be his VP candidate. Nonetheless, he is sworn in on Air Force One, and that transition is actually pretty smooth. LBJ decides to keep a lot of the Kennedy advisors around him, and he is promising to fulfill the legacy of Kennedy, to aim for the same goals Kennedy had aimed for. Nonetheless, the nation was in mourning. He was shot down in the prime of his life. He had young children, a beautiful young wife who is now a widow. So the whole world's really in mourning. And they really acclaimed him more for his ideals than what he actually got done. You know, JFK had a lot of ideas that he wanted to accomplish, but none of them actually came to fruition. So it was more of the idea of him that people were mourning than actual things he accomplished. But nonetheless, later on we'll see JFK's reputation kind of harmed when knowledge about his affairs, his womanizing, if you will, come out, and also his involvement in some organized crime came out. But nonetheless, typically JFK is remembered as one of those good presidents. All right, section I, the LBJ brand on the presidency. So this is talking about Lyndon B. Johnson's presidency. Okay, Johnson, just as a person, he was really tall, right? He was 6'3", he was from Texas. He had been in Congress off and on since 1937, and he was really kind of a New Dealer at heart. He had really looked up to FDR, so kind of one of those liberal Democrats, so to speak. He had been the majority leader, the Democratic majority leader in 1954, and he was really known as being kind of a tough guy, so to speak, kind of like a bully in the Senate. He would often give people the Johnson treatment. He'd get like an inch away from their face, kind of leaning over them, like being very aggressive, very intimidating within the Senate. But he was very persuasive also. And he had just this legendary ego. Example, when he was president, he ended up visiting the Pope at the Vatican. And as customary, the Pope gives him a gift. It was like a 14th century painting. And in return, Lyndon B. Johnson gives the Pope a bust of Lyndon B. Johnson. This guy's got a big ego. But we don't have time to get into that. Nonetheless, just as president, he was typically more liberal than he was even within the Senate. Because remember, he's from Texas, so he has to be in line with his constituents, which are tended to be more conservative in Texas. But now that he's president, he doesn't have to worry about Texas anymore, and we see he's very liberal, takes kind of that FDR stance of things. All right, so we'll just kind of hit on a couple things Johnson puts forth. A huge one is the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So we'll see kind of two ginormous pieces of civil rights legislation come out of the 60s. The first one being the Civil Rights Act of 1964. There's going to be a voting one next year, but don't worry about that yet. Okay, Civil Rights Act of 64. He wanted to pass it in honor of JFK, saying, you know, remember, JFK had been the one who proposed it, JFK had been the one who was kind of fighting for it, so now Johnson takes it and puts it on this platter, saying, this is what our dead president wanted after all. In this Civil Rights Act, it banned racial discrimination in public venues, strengthened the federal government's power to desegregate schools, outlawed employers from discriminating based on race, national origin, and actually they slipped in their gender. So that'll become important later on. So no discrimination based on race, national origin, or gender. And within the Civil Rights Act, they created the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission that helped to actually enforce the law, because laws aren't much unless they're actually enforced. So this is huge. So this is pretty much everything civil rights outside of the voting realm of things. Okay, so desegregating America. Praise the Lord. Also, 1965, as a side note, Johnson issues an executive order requiring all federal contracts to take affirmative action against discrimination. You'll spend a lot of time in government next year, I'm sure, talking about affirmative action. But just so you know, what affirmative action is kind of favoring members of a disadvantaged group. So maybe setting aside so many spots in a college to be African American. Maybe if you're hiring for, I don't know, a post office, reserving a couple of those spots for minority groups, that sort of thing. So he signed something promoting affirmative action within the federal realm of things. Okay, Lyndon B. Johnson, two things you really should know regarding domestic policy is one, his war on poverty, and he really, he's pushing through Kennedy's tax bill that wants to cut taxes, but he's also adding to this bill that's cutting taxes proposals for $1 billion given to help fight poverty, and he's specifically focusing on the Appalachian Mountain area, where there had been a really a hard go at things because the coal industry is going away, and tens of thousands of people in the Appalachian area had lost their jobs. So his war on poverty wants to eliminate poverty across the nation, but really focuses in on the Appalachian area as well. Okay, so war on poverty, huge, 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 Johnson. Another huge thing is just kind of the term of his presidency. We had the New Frontier for Kennedy. For Johnson, it's really the Great Society. That's the term he gives his administration. And this is a lot of kind of like New Deal-ish programs. Remember, Johnson had always loved FDR. So economic and welfare measures. And this policy, the Great Society, was really spurred on by a book that was very famous at this time, Michael Harrington's The Other America. This was published in 1962 and revealed that about 20% of the population in America suffered from poverty. So, once again, that book was called The Other American, and this produced the idea of a great society with the war on poverty, really bringing fighting against poverty. Why not? Good job, Johnson. Okay, Section J. Johnson battles Goldwater in 1964. So this is talking about the 64 election. Remember, Kennedy was elected in 60, then he was killed, and then LBJ is president. So now Johnson's going to run for president against Goldwater in 64. If that was not obvious enough, I'm glad I repeated it. Nonetheless, the Democrats, it was an easy idea. They're like, we're going to keep Johnson. They love him. Like, he's like a tried and true Democrat, very liberal, wanting to bring around all of these social reforms. Democrats were like, we're super happy with Johnson. Not a problem. Okay, Republicans decide to nominate Barry Goldwater of Arizona, and he was like the absolute opposite of Johnson. Johnson's all like, I'm liberal. Let's bring back the New Deal. And then Goldwater's like, no, I'm conservative. Let's kill all the vestiges of the New Deal that are left. So Goldwater attacked, federal income tax, Social Security, the Tennessee Valley Authority, civil rights, the Great Society, pretty much all things Democratic. Goldwater was like, I hate that. Okay. The Democrats, in turn, they really kind of branded Goldwater as this trigger-happy cowboy from Arizona that was going to bring about the end of the world by triggering World War III. Okay. Americans kind of fearing Goldwater would trigger World War III and kind of optimistic about this Johnson's kind of this ideal great society. Johnson actually fairly easily wins 486 to 52 in the Electoral College. And we also see Democrats, remember, Johnson's a Democrat, huge majorities in Congress for the Democrats as well. So 64 is a victory for the Democrats. Okay. All right, within this section, they kind of throw this in here because this is the time it happens, but this will relate actually more to the Vietnam War, which we'll get to at the end of this chapter, but still you ought to know about it. This is kind of, the issue is the Tonkin Gulf, okay? So what's happening here is this is actually not that big of a deal, but Johnson makes a big deal out of it to help along his image during the campaign. So this is what happens. Two American destroyers, kind of like battleships, are cruising along the coast of North Vietnam. And supposedly, they are unprovokedly, they are attacked or fired upon by the North Vietnamese. Okay, so that's the story that gets to America. Usually these two destroyers, American destroyers, along the coast of North Vietnam, they're unprovokingly attacked by the North Vietnamese. Okay. The real story, which we now know, is that probably they were not unprovoked. It was probably the case that the destroyers, the U.S. destroyers, fired upon the North Vietnamese, and they fired upon the destroyers in return in self-defense. but that's not what gets to America. In America's mind, there are these 2 American ships that are being fired upon for no reason by the North Vietnamese. Okay, so in response, Johnson goes to Congress and gets something called the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, because these ships were fired upon in the Tonkin Gulf. Now we know. Okay, so Tonkin Gulf, really what it is it's a blank check to use further force in Southeast Asia without Congress's approval. So more or less, remember, it's Congress that gets to declare war. Congress is saying, never mind, Tonkin Gulf Resolution. Here you go, Johnson. You don't have to ask our permission to use military force in Southeast Asia. You just do what you need to do, right? Kind of like a blank check, giving up their right to declare war. So Johnson gets this in hand. This will become important later on, but it's really during this election period that all of this goes down. Shoo. Okay, nonetheless, Section K. The Great Society Congress. Okay, so after the 1964 election, we have Democratic Johnson is president, and then huge Democratic majorities in both the House and the Senate. So the path is wide open for some big legislation to go down the barrel, so to speak. Democrats have a 2-to-1 majority, and they just start this flood of new legislation, kind of harkening back almost to that 100 days of FDR. Just a ton of stuff is passed. We're not going to talk about everything. Some things, for example, they add 2 members of Congress. They add 2 cabinet members. 2 cabinet members is what I was trying to say. The Department of Transportation, and also HUD. Right, HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and he actually appoints as the Cabinet Secretary of HUD, Robert Weaver, who happens to be African American. So Robert Weaver, the Secretary of, or the Cabinet member for HUD, is the first Black Cabinet Secretary we'll see. I think I said that the most inefficient way possible. All right, to repeat myself, Robert Weaver, first Black cabinet member, he heads the Department of Housing and Urban Development. All right, let's keep going on. But really, when we're talking about all this new legislation for the Great Society, there's really kind of 4 areas he focuses on. 1, aid to education. Remember, education's typically a state thing, but he wants federal aid for education. And the idea is he'd give federal money to each child, and then that child can take that money with them to either a public school or like a parochial school, like a private school. Because the parochial schools are really kind of struggling at this time, so he ensures that they can help those along as well by funding the individual child, not necessarily individual schools. Also he starts the Head Start program, which is kind of a preschool program as well. So that's 1, aid to education. 2, we have medical help for the elderly and the poor. So there's 2 words, right? There's Medicare and there's Medicaid. Okay, Medicare is for the elderly. Medicaid, thinking of aid, is for the poor. So Medicare and Medicaid are 2 things he gets passed in 1965. Okay, 3, third area, that's 3. Immigration reform. And this is actually kind of a big deal. He abolishes the national origins quota system that had been in place since 1921, saying so many people can immigrate each year based on how many people already live in the United States. It was kind of that complicated, messy situation. But that quota system's going away. And this is through the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965. The Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965. And through this act, we actually about double the amount of people we allow to immigrate each year. And this is also the first time we actually limit people from the Western Hemisphere. So we never had really limited immigration from the Western Hemisphere, from like Latin American countries, but in 65 we do start to put some brakes on that immigration. Okay, a part of this law, this legislation, allowed for family unification, which said they gave special privileges to people who had close relatives living in the United States. So it became a lot easier for you to immigrate to the United States if you already had some family members here. And unbeknownst to the people making this law, about 100,000 people each year took advantage of this. So we actually see kind of a swell of immigration we weren't expecting. Also surprising to the people who are creating this, we see a shift of immigration away from Europe. So we see less people from Europe immigrating, but actually we see more people from Latin America start to immigrate to the United States. So this is where that shift takes place, kind of in the mid-60s. Okay, but nonetheless, if you're talking about the Great Society, it did work in a limited form, right? Not all of the goals were accomplished, but, some of the battles were won for immigration, or I shouldn't say for immigration, but for the Great Society. Okay, so I think I only said 3, right? Yep, 1, 2, 3. So we had aid to education, Medicare for the elderly, and Medicaid for the poor, immigration reform, and then of course we're going to be talking about number 4, which is civil rights, and we has a number of sections on civil rights. Okay, so battling for black rights. Section L is really going to be talking more or less about the passing of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. But there's a long road to hoe before we actually get to that. But that's what the section's leading up to, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Okay, let's talk about Mississippi. Why not? Okay, so Mississippi, only about 5% of people, or African Americans, who were eligible to vote were actually registered. So a very tiny number, only 5% were registered to vote. And that was due to poll taxes, literacy tests, just open intimidation. In fact, there's a law in Mississippi that's required all local papers to publish for 2 weeks the name of all African Americans who are registered to vote. So if you registered to vote, your name was going to be in the paper, and you got to believe there was going to be some reprisals from that. So things were not looking good in Mississippi specifically. We see in 1964, this is called Freedom Summer, and this is really when we're now starting to focus our attention through the civil rights movement on getting the right to vote. Remember, before it was all about segregation. We want to desegregate schools. We want to desegregate society. And that shift happened after 64. 64, we had that civil rights legislation passed. So now the shift is at, let's get people registered to vote. So that's the focus now, registered to vote. Okay. Freedom Summer 1964, massive voter registration drives in Mississippi by blacks and whites alike, and their chant was, "We shall overcome, we shall overcome." Okay, and that summer, the Freedom Summer, in June, we see 1 black and 2 white civil rights workers were found dead after being badly beaten. In retaliation for this, the FBI goes down there and actually makes 21 arrests, revolving around these 3 deaths. But the thing was, the white juries in the South absolutely refused to convict anyone of these crimes. So things weren't looking good for them. Okay. Later on, Martin Luther King in 1965 resumes this voter registration campaign, but this time it's going to be in Selma, Alabama. Before we talked about Birmingham, we're not talking about Birmingham. Now we're focused really on Selma, Alabama. And this is Martin Luther King. So what happens is they're having this peaceful protest. They're marching to the capital of Alabama in Montgomery, from Selma to Montgomery. And during this march, absolutely brutal protests, or not brutal protests, but the protesters were treated, the marchers were treated brutally. State troops used tear gas and whips to assault these peaceful protesters. We see 2 people around this time are actually killed. One is a Unitarian minister, another was a white woman from Detroit. So things in Selma are definitely heating up. So this time Johnson is president. Johnson, in response to this violence in Selma, went on TV, and a part of the speech he says, we must overcome, echoing the chant of the protesters. We must overcome the crippling legacy of bigotry and injustice. We must overcome, or we shall overcome. So Johnson, after he sees all of this stuff going down in Alabama, he passes through or pushes through Congress. Being Johnson, he can do whatever he wants, right? Democratic president with a Democratic majority passes through Congress the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So this is another huge civil rights legislation that's passed. The first one being in 64, the second one revolving around the right to vote, Voting Rights Act of 1965, and this is passed on August 6th. Okay, and so after this is literally about 100 years exactly after the Civil War ends, and this is really a big shift for the civil rights movement, a ginormous victory. So now that blacks feel more confident in their abilities or their safety to vote, we see white Southerners kind of courting the black vote more and more, trying to change around policies to gain black voters, that sort of thing. So very successful, very big piece of legislation. And this is actually after the Voting Rights Act of 65. This is the first time we actually see blacks start to actually immigrate back to the South. Before, everyone was leaving to these northern cities, but now after this Voting Rights Act is passed, we see more African Americans actually start to migrate back to the South. All right, Section M, Black Power. So, the Voting Rights Act also marked an end of the era in the civil rights movement. We'll see a shift in the civil rights movement. Before 65, we really see, peaceful protests, wanting to integrate into white society, sort of speak, that sort of thing. But now, there's definitely a shift. Things are going to get a lot more militant, a lot more violent, and a lot less kind of working with whites, going into white society, and more being isolated, being separated, being proud of being African American, and not necessarily working hand in hand with the white communities. Let's talk about it. Okay, so just 5 days after the Voting Rights Act is passed, there's this huge week-long riot that breaks out in this black neighborhood of Watts. So Watts is in LA, so this is in California, and what happens is blacks actually burn and loot their own neighborhoods for about a week. And this is in response to police brutality. At least that's what they say. So they're not looting white neighborhoods. They're literally looting and burning down their own neighborhoods. And this lasts for about a week in the Watts neighborhood of LA. When all is said and done, over 1,000 were injured, 31 blacks and 3 whites were killed, and hundreds of buildings were destroyed. So it's really this Watts riot that really sparks, or really is the shift between the traditional, Martin Luther King, we shall overcome, nonviolent protest in the South. After this Watts riot, there's definitely a shift, okay? Now, a lot of these, this new phase, it's more militant. It's now more in the north and in western cities. It's led more by radical spokespeople, not really aimed at interracial cooperation, but on black separatism, black separation, okay, or isolation. So kind of the second wave of the civil rights starts after the Voting Rights Act is signed in 65 and after this Watts riot. A new leader we see emerge in this kind of second wave is Malcolm X. Malcolm X being from the Nation of Islam, brilliant, charismatic, wanted to be separation from the blue-eyed white devils. And he ends up being killed by a rival in the Nation of Islam. He was killed when he was speaking in front of a large crowd in New York City. So definitely a big shift. This is where the Black Panther Party comes up. Black Panther Party, you could say it's a political party. It starts in Oakland, California. This is very militant, meaning they're armed. It's headed by Stokely Carmichael. That's how you say that. It started in 66 by Stokely Carmichael, and he had been the head of the SNCC, ironically the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. So he had been the head of the SNCC, but now he's kind of starting this Black Panther Party, and he's preaching the idea of black power, kind of resurrecting the idea of black nationalism, kind of that separation of the African American community, really promoting kind of a distinct black culture, going back to, you know, the Afro hair, more traditional African American dress, getting rid of their white names and choosing more traditional African names, demanding, you know, black studies in the university, that sort of thing. So Black Power, Black Panthers, kind of this new wave of the civil rights movement. And it was kind of ironic because after, you know, two major victories in the civil rights movement, that's when we start to see all that rioting happen. We saw the Watts riot, but we see riots throughout northern cities. For example, in '67, Newark, New Jersey, 25 were dead. Detroit, 23 were dead. You know, they were burning their own neighborhoods and attacking police officers and firemen that were there to try to stop the rioting. And this, you know, they were chanting, "Burn, baby, burn," literally. And this was just absolutely baffling, you know, to me, myself, but also to the white Northerners who thought this race thing was a Southern issue. And, you know, why are they rioting in their own neighborhoods? What's going on? So this was definitely angered a lot of white Northerners, but also baffled them. Like, I thought this was something that was in the South, because before this point, all of these demonstrations had been in the South, but after the second wave, we see this being in more northern cities. Okay, and Black Power was definitely, now their focus was on economic demands. So we started seeing the civil rights, they're starting about desegregation. It was all about desegregation. And then it was all about voters' rights. And now we see the Black Power, their cry is really economic rights, economic equality, economic demands. Well, unfortunately, on April 4th of 1968, this is where the moderate voice of Martin Luther King Jr. is silenced forever by the bullet of a sniper in Memphis, Tennessee. So, I mean, the time couldn't have been worse to lose Martin Luther King Jr. because he was really the voice of moderation, a very well-respected leader across both racial groups, and his death really, you know, it was tragic, but it couldn't have been at a worse time because we really, really needed him to kind of help unite the civil rights movement, sort of speak, hopefully to moderate it a bit. All right, his death, you know, it just triggers more of this ghetto violence throughout cities nationwide. There's riots all over the place. About 40 are killed in these riots. But, you know, just kind of showing the progress of the civil rights movement, the section just mentions, you know, over time, we see an increase in voter registration in southern states. By the late 60s, we see several hundred blacks in office. By 72, about half of the black children in the South are in integrated schools. And we see about 1/3 of black families in the middle class. So there's definitely going to be some movement forward. All right, last video will focus more on foreign policy and Vietnam.